The works was very quiet, save for the quiet grumbling of its single engine. Sir Handel was sulking. Ever since Skarloey had gone away to be mended, he and Peter Sam were doing all of the work. He'd been asked to take a passenger train and had grumbled dreadfully all the way. These coaches, they were not like the coaches from his old railway, not the ones he was used to. To him, they were simply cattle trucks with their single axle and wheel. Real coaches, he would say, had bogies, and this railway had none. They'd grumbled and shrieked all the way up the line. At the top station, he'd left his train at the platform to get a drink from the water column. When he backed down to couple up to his coaches, his driver hadn't noticed a crate that had slipped off the porter's trolley and fallen on the line. The coaches had noticed, but they didn't say anything. They were cross with Sir Handel and wanted to pay him out. He'd hit the crate and managed to lever himself off the rails. He smashed into the station platform, damaging his rear wheels. Now he was in the works, alone and frustrated.
Those blasted cattle trucks! I'll be sure to teach them a jolly good lesson when I next see them. Maybe the thing controller will get some real coaches for a change.
They are real coaches, even if they don't look like it.
The voice made Sir Handel jump. He looked over to the standard gauge line next to him. A big, red tender engine, pushing a single coach, was backing down into the sidings. But this engine didn't have a number on its tender, just the letters LNWR. The coach had 2 axles, was painted cream and white with yellow lining like the express coaches. As the engine came alongside, it looked down at Sir Handel. Both engine and coach were covered in grime and dirt. To see an impressive red engine with a coach looking this shabby, it was honestly shocking, since it was known that the NWR took care of its engines. Why not this one? The engine spoke again.
Coaches come in many shapes and sizes, my dear engine. You wouldn't like me calling you a toy, would you?
No!
Sir Handel said, gathering his courage.
Because I'm not a toy!
But you are too small to be an engine such as me. So by your logic, you must not be a real engine.
Sir Handel was getting annoyed.
I am a real engine! I pulled the express trains on my old line, but those cattle trucks...
Coaches.
The engine corrected.
They let me have an accident. That's why I'm here in the works now. It's all their fault.
Sir Handel grunted. The engine sighed loudly. It sounded like it was finding the smaller engine infuriating to listen to.
Be happy that is the worst you've gotten from a coach. Coaches are to be respected, only bumped when they themselves misbehave and are awkward during passenger runs. Mistreat your coaches without cause, and they will mistreat you.
Rubbish!
Oh, then I guess no one has ever told you.
The engine said, a cold smirk forming on his face.
Told me what?
Oh, nothing. Just something I've heard. And it's too late for stories. You wouldn't.
Yes, I would. What was I supposed to be told?
The big engine grinned a little wider, steam hissing quietly from his pistons. Despite this engine's red paint, Sir Handel felt it should have been painted blue from the cold feeling he was getting from this engine.
I suppose I could tell you a story that no one ever really talks about on this railway. Not that I'm surprised. It's a bit of a mystery, but if you insist, then I'll tell you.
And so, the engine began. The Northwestern Railway had just been formed. The expansive line, reaching from Vickerstown to the end at Tidmouth, was going through a tough few years. The line's first 2 engines were too small to handle the workload. As such, the board of directors had brought many more engines on loan from other railways to help. And I'm sorry to say, frictions existed as the loaned engines treated the resident engines quite poorly. Oi you, take me coaches and up to it.
Hop to it yourself. I'm getting this train ready.
Thomas scoffed. Typical little shunter. No sense of duty.
Late again! I thought you were supposed to be an express engine.
Another engine wheeshed as Edward clanked into the station.
Don't blame me. It was a faulty signal.
Edward huffed, out of breath.
Of course. It's always something else. You wouldn't have this kind of mess on the GER if the board of directors had any sense of progress. They'd allow head office to oversee everything.
Another engine was a large Clawton from the LNWR. This engine had glistening red paint with black side plates. This engine, named Afton, was more picky about the kinds of coaches he was given. He saw all the old single-axle Victorian rolling stock as relics. Like the other visiting engines, he was absolutely appalled at the idea of pulling goods trains, because to see a grand engine such as him doing so was an insult. One morning, Afton huffed into the station. He was to be pulling the local stopping service today. But as he neared the station, he hissed angrily as he saw the coaches he'd been given. He was given the small single-axle coaches. While they were painted in the NWR cream and dark green, they were smaller and older than the bogie coaches given.
What's this? I'm pulling this ghastly groaning train today? The indignity of it all!
Just be happy you have a train to pull at all.
Thomas hissed as he pushed the coaches up.
I've had to hunt the yards for extra coaches.
Then you can jolly well take these coaches away and bring me some proper coaches.
I'm busy. Take them or leave them.
Thomas huffed and hurried away into the yards before Afton could say anything more. Come on, old boy. Let's get this over with. Afton's driver sighed. The coaches groaned as Afton backed up to them. They had heard what Afton had called them and were not happy. "Who is this rude engine?" asked the lead coach. "An improper engine if he's pulling us," said another. "I'd rather be pulled by Edward or even Thomas. At least they are proper engines who know how to treat coaches right," the brake coach added.
Shut up! I am a proper engine. Better than Tiny Thomas or Old Iron Edward. Now come along!
The guard's whistle blew and Afton huffed out of the station in a rage. His face was almost as red as his paint. As Afton raced down the line, the old coaches groaned and creaked. They were older and were not used to running at express train speeds. They tittered nervously as they rolled along. "Slow down! Slow down!" they wailed.
Shut up! Shut up!
Afton barked back. Just then, the brakes on the train came on. Afton stopped suddenly on the viaduct, grumbling dreadfully. An investigation of the coaches showed that the coach just behind the engine had a loose vacuum hose. While the crew set about fixing the problem, Afton fumed angrily. He thought the coaches were doing that on purpose, making him late. Eventually, the brakes came off and the train puffed away. When Afton arrived at the last station, the big red engine hissed mournfully as he moved around the yard to shunt his own coaches away. The coaches tittered grumpily as he did so. "At last, the journey is over," one said. "I felt like my windows were going to fall out," said another. "At least you two were further away from him than I was. I had to endure his groaning all the way here," said the lead coach.
It would have been better if you'd not decided to hold me up, you rotten old antique.
What? You blame me for that? That was your fault.
Pull the other one, you horrid thing.
It's not my fault you don't know how to pull coaches, you rotten red sausage. Afton quickly lost his temper. His boiler pressure shot up, and amid the hiss of his safety valve, there was a bang, and then a splintering crunch. Afton hadn't been paying attention when he'd entered the carriage sidings, and had run his coaches into the buffers hard. The buffers were bent and broken, but they were not the most damaged. That honor belonged to the coach behind Afton's tender. It was squashed between him and the second coach, crushed into a pile of splintered wood and bent metal. The other coaches shrieked in horror at the fate of their sister. Afton just sniffed indignantly.
This is what you get for being weak, old antiques. If you only been proper coaches, this wouldn't have happened.
The directors were not happy with Afton's carelessness. One of them, a man named Topham Hatt, spoke the most severely. If you were our engine, I'd send you away. Afton just sniffed. He didn't care at all. He watched as the broken coach was loaded into some trucks to be taken away. The other coaches were silent during the whole process. After a while, Afton just smirked and backed away to the sheds to rest. Afton's driver was assigned to another engine to learn how to properly handle coaches, and Afton himself was shut up in the shed for a few weeks before the directors allowed him to pull trains again. The other visiting engines were the only ones to show any sympathy for his careless handling. During his stay in the shed, a new train was offered by the Northwestern Railway. It was a late-night train that offered an express run to Tidmouth, called the Midnight Special. The bigger tender engines enjoyed the job immensely. The idea of a non-stop run from one end of the island to the other under the stars made them feel very important. Soon it was Afton's turn to pull the Midnight Special.
About time I had a named train of my own to pull, and with proper coaches, and no less. The only thing better would be the express,
he said loudly. The other engines just groaned. They ignored the big red engine's boasting until he left the shed. Afton puffed into the station, bubbling with excitement as he coupled up to the lead coach. He was so excited that he never looked back once at the rake of coaches he was pulling. No one noticed the coach closest to the engine didn't belong in the consist. It was painted cream and green, just like the Express. But it was smaller and had no bogies, just 2 axles. It was filthier and didn't look like a coach belonging on a prestigious train such as the Midnight Special. The guard blew his whistle and the train set off. Over the sound of the engine puffing, there was a loud groaning noise that came from the lead coach. It sounded like it hadn't been oiled in a long time. Soon, the express passed under the signals and was gone in a cloud of steam. A phone rang in the signal box at Kelsthorpe Road. When the signalman answered it, it was a call from the signalman at Kildane. He wanted to know if the Midnight Special had passed through to check that the system was still operating. The Kelsthorpe signalman said he'd received a bell from the Crovansgate signal box a long time ago, but the express hadn't come yet. He checked his watch. The express was running half an hour behind. Just before the signalman could hang up the phone to call Crovansgate to send a work train to check the line, there was a knock at his door. He opened it to see the Midnight Special's guard standing there, panting heavily. "Have you seen our engine?" he asked. "What engine? No engine has passed by my box for over an hour." The guard then went pale. That's not possible. You must be mistaken. I've just come from the Midnight Special, and I've not seen our engine anywhere. I swear on me mother's head, no train puffed past this signal box, I would have seen it. Come on, man, you're speaking all kinds of rubbish. I am not. Our entire train is missing its engine. It's like it's disappeared into thin air. Come on, mate. Have a cup of tea and explain what you're trying to say. A works train was soon dispatched from Crovan's Gate. They found all 6 express coaches sitting on the main line neatly, and the irate passengers. From passenger testimony, they said one moment the train was rolling along smoothly, then, after the tunnel, the train went slower and slower until the coaches ground to a halt. When they looked out the window to see what the problem was, they saw there was no engine at the front of their train. Workmen investigated the coaches for damage, but none was found. The coupling on the lead coach was intact. While the works engine pulled the train back to the station, the workmen searched up the line. Perhaps the engine had derailed somewhere before Kelsthorpe, and the guard just missed it. However, nothing. No trace of an engine, or even an accident, could be found. The engine crew was found the next morning, asleep on a bench at Crovan's Gate by a cleaner making the rounds before the first service of the day. When asked how they got there, they had no memory of what happened after their engine entered the tunnel. Just that, one minute they were entering the tunnel, and the next they were waking up on the platform. A massive search was held to look for the engine, but nothing could be found. For a long time, the Midnight Express was discontinued as the more superstitious passengers refused to ride the express after midnight, worried that if a whole engine could vanish, then why not a whole train of passengers? The mystery deepened when many of the passengers expressed concern for the people who might have gotten in the first coach. The investigators noted that all the coaches were still on the train, but the passengers were insistent that a coach was missing from the express, a small coach just behind the engine. Station staff, porters, and the engine crew of the shunder who assembled the train were just as adamant that they had gathered the rake of 6 express coaches, no more, no less. After extensive investigations, relief was brought to the passengers to hear that everyone who'd bought a ticket for the Midnight Express was accounted for. But the mystery remained. What happened to the engine and the alleged coach? How could an engine's crew wake up at a station with no memory of how they'd gotten there? To this day, the file remains in the Vickerstown police files as unsolved.
And that is the end of the story as the wider public knows, though there have been tales of engines seeing this often, puffing along the line in the distance with a single coach behind him. But no one can be certain what they saw was real or not.
The engine finished. Sir Handel stared up. His frames felt as cold as ice. He gulped and began to rally his courage.
Preposterous! I've never heard of such a thing.
Are you calling me a liar?
The big grid engine asked, glaring down at the smaller engine.
No, I'm not. I'm just saying that just doesn't happen. Ghosts don't exist, and coaches certainly can't do that either.
The big grid engine looked down at Sir Handel before sniffing and looking up. Even without the engine looking down, his voice still made Sir Handel shudder.
Deny it all you want, little engine, but heed my warning. Even something as humble as a coach does not take kindly to be mistreated. They have their ways of getting even, and a simple matter such as death won't offer protection from retribution.
Whatever, big engine. Anyways, it's late and...
I have a name, you know, you impudent little blue bug.
Oh? And what is that, then?
Afton.
Suddenly, the coach creaked loudly. The red engine, Afton, gave a heavy sigh.
I've rested long enough. I must be going. We must keep time, you know.
Sir Handel blinked as his own words echoed back at him. The big engine hissed steam and slowly pulled out of the sidings, the coach creaking and groaning as it was dragged behind. Soon it vanished beyond the gloom of the yard lights and was gone. Sir Handel thought about the story for a moment before he sniffed.
That engine's talking a lot of nonsense.
Before long, he closed his eyes and fell asleep. Sir Handel's repairs didn't take too long, so he was soon back to pulling trains. His first job was to pull a passenger train, because Peter Sam was up taking slate from the quarry. He clanked crossly to the yard and coupled up to the coaches before dragging them to the platform. Gordon was waiting there.
What's got your pistons in a fizzle this morning?
He asked as Sir Handel hissed mournfully into the station.
It's these wretched coaches. They let me have an accident the day before, and then last night, some stupid red engine talks nonsense about taking care of them.
James wouldn't know how to take care of coaches, being a mixed traffic engine.
Gordon huffed indignantly.
James? No, I'm talking about that other red engine.
Gordon raised an eyebrow.
We only have one red engine. We don't have another red engine.
Yes, you do. Afton.
Afton? Now that is a name I have not heard in years.
Why is that?
He worked on our line for a while, even after I came to Sodor. Then one day, he was just gone. People said he just vanished, but I think he was just sent away after he left his coaches on the main line. Good riddance.
Now it was Sir Handel's turn to be confused.
But I saw him last night.
My dear engine, Afton has never been on this island for almost 32 years, let alone been seen since.
Just then, the guard's whistle blew, and the big blue engine huffed away, leaving Sir Handel with his thoughts. How could he see an engine that hadn't been on Sodor in so long? Then he remembered the story. A sudden chill ran down his saddle tanks as it all became too clear. It wasn't possible, indeed, to see an engine that hadn't been on Sodor in so long, and in such a shabby condition. Unless it hadn't really been there. The guard's whistle blew, and Sir Handel puffed away with the coaches, without so much as a complaint. Sir Handel has become a more even-tempered engine since then. Though he does still grumble about doing extra work, he has never used the words cattle trucks in the presence of the coaches again. The coaches, for their part, have just left the reason for the change alone. Why ruin a good thing, they say. Though on certain nights, just after midnight, the sound of an engine puffing past with one coach in tow can be heard, a flash of red can be seen, and then in a blink of an eye, the engine is gone into the night. Gone without a trace. The evening was falling on Sodor. The engines were stuck in the shunting yard because the points leading to the turntable were jammed. As the workmen mended them, the engines became bored. They all wanted to rest in their nice, warm sheds. To pass the time, they began to talk about the upcoming Halloween celebrations.
I heard a little boy on the platform saying he's going to be a zombie this year.
Percy said.
What is a zombie?
It's a monster that is said to be a dead human come back to life. Or at least that's what my driver said. He saw a movie about them with his wife once.
Edward explained. Edward then chuckled.
But she didn't enjoy it, so he said.
Oh, That sounds scary.
Percy said, shivering. Gordon, James, and Henry just laughed. Pah! What nonsense! James huffed. The idea of a person coming back to life as a corpse is just complete rubbish. Percy huffed. Then he grinned at Thomas.
You are partly right, James,
he said.
The idea of a human coming back to life from the dead is rubbish, but...
He paused impressively. But what? James asked.
While a human coming back from the dead is impossible, something else might be, he said quietly.
What are you getting at, little Percy?
Gordon grunted.
Well,
said Percy,
before I came to Sodor, I met an engine who came into the workshop where the first Fat Controller met me. He told me a tale about a railway far, far away from here. This railway was a small branch that served some farms in a large iron ore mine. The controller of this railway wasn't very kind like the Fat Controller. In fact, he was very cruel and greedy. He hardly ever spent any money on maintaining the engines, and he poured his money into his own pockets. The engines were always in pain when they worked. The drivers, firemen, and mine employees felt sorry for the engine's pain. They lodged their complaints with the controller, but he didn't care. Soon, the farms and mines began to use the roads instead, using horse and cart instead of the rail line. Unless the controller did something, he finally caved and promised that he would find a solution. And he did.
Percy paused and gave a shudder. The three big engines stared in shock.
What did he do?
Henry asked.
One night, one of the engines, number 3242, was asked to stay at a special shed that the controller had reserved for him. The engine who told me the story said he woke up in the middle of the night to hear the other engine crying in pain. A light inside the shed flickered, and the scream suddenly stopped. After a few moments, the light went out and the shed doors opened. He closed his eyes to pretend he was asleep. As he heard the footsteps crunching away on the ballast, he opened an eye and saw the controller walking back to his office. The engine went back to sleep, thinking it was just some dream.
Percy paused, shuddering again.
Oh, how wrong was he?
The three big engines stared in horror, enthralled by the story.
The next day, the controller met the people who complained at the station.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've heard your complaints about the pain of the engines. Rest assured, I have taken steps to fix this. Let me introduce you to the new and improved number 3242.
The engine was in the yard and saw what happened next. There came number 3242, creaking and groaning like always with his scratched paint. Men gasped in horror. A woman fainted. The controller just chuckled. Where the engine's face used to be was now nothing but a smokebox door.
I've taken care of 3242's pain. He won't complain anymore. He could still be,
he said,
really useful.
The big engines gasped in shock. The idea that an engine, once living and breathing, was rendered dead, yet still forced to work on like... zombie engine, James said, quivering.
The controller didn't stop there,
ventured Percy.
He kept going, doing whatever horrible thing he did to render an engine like 3242. The engine crews refused to drive their engines after this, but they were replaced with new crews. People called him a murderer, but he didn't care.
I am the controller, and engines are best seen and not heard,
was all he said.
What about the engine who told you the story?
Gordon gasped.
His crew saved him. One night, the engine crew fired him up, and they left the railway. They didn't know where they would go, or what they would do. But working anywhere was better than working on that railway. Better than working among the living dead.
There was silence in the yard. Just then, a workman came walking up.
The points are fixed. You can get back to the sheds now,
he said. The three big engines took off quickly. Edward remained behind. He looked at Percy and chuckled once they were out of earshot.
Do you think we should tell him about the faceless engines?
He asked.
Maybe some other time, after Halloween,
Percy said cheekily. And the three engines puffed off to join the others in the shed.
It was a foggy night on the Farquhar branch. Thomas had just finished taking his last train of the day and puffed safely back to the sheds he shared with Percy and Toby. When he arrived, Percy was telling Toby a scary story. "Are you still going on about those silly ghost stories?" Thomas asked as he backed down into the sheds.
"I'm telling Toby about a demon train,"
Percy replied. "A demon train? Whatever next?" Thomas laughed. Toby gave an amused sigh and rolled his eyes.
"Please continue,"
he said to Percy.
"No one knows what this engine looks like. The only thing they can make out is the shape of the smoke box,"
Percy continued. Thomas didn't bother listening to the rest and backed further into the shed. "It's all just a bunch of rubbish," he said to himself before he drifted off to sleep. A while later, Thomas opened his eyes. He looked around. The fog seemed to have gotten thicker, making the area around him seem smaller, which made him feel more isolated. Thomas couldn't help but feel something was off. He looked around again, but slowly and more closely. He turned his gaze to the tracks in front of him, and could vaguely make out the shape of an engine's smoke box through the fog. Thomas felt uneasy, especially given that he couldn't make out anything except for the black shape of the smoke box. Thomas eyed it, trying to see if there were any features. He would soon regret it. He was able to make out something. 2 tiny, barely visible white dots where the eyes would be. Thomas stared, wide-eyed and mouth agape at the sight. Then, the engine began to move closer to him. Thomas was now panicking. "Help!" he screamed, but no sound came from his mouth. The engine moved closer. Thomas was frantic. He tried to scream, but he couldn't. He tried to whistle for help, but he couldn't. He tried to reverse, but he couldn't. Nothing Thomas tried was working. It was like he had no control of himself, that he was trapped in his own frame. The specter was now just a few yards away from him. Thomas shut his eyes and prepared for the worst. Thomas waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing happened. He carefully squinted, then fully opened his eyes. The fog was now not as thick as it was, and the thing he had seen was now gone. "What was that?" Thomas asked quietly before realizing he could talk again. Thomas was glad that he was back in control of himself, but he didn't feel safe. Whatever it was that he saw was probably still out there, still watching him. Thomas didn't dare go back to sleep, too afraid of the specter returning and him not being able to escape. The fog still covered the branch line as Thomas puffed along it the next day. He was still tense from the previous night and kept looking all around him, trying to make sure that what he saw wasn't anywhere in sight, remaining silent the whole while. When he returned to the sheds that evening, Percy and Toby were waiting for him.
"Are you alright, Thomas?"
Percy asked. I'm fine, thanks," Thomas replied.
"It doesn't sound like it,"
said Toby. "I'm alright, really," Thomas insisted. "I'm just a bit nervous about the fog. Trying to be careful, you know." Percy and Toby didn't persist and fell asleep instead. Thomas stayed awake, however. He was scared and continued eyeing his surroundings, trying to make sure the specter wouldn't appear again. He was exhausted the next day as he puffed into Elsbridge. He was eyeing the station in a nearby yard and trying to stay awake. He would jolt himself awake every time he began to nod off, but he wasn't able to keep it up for long.
"Wake up, Thomas,"
James whistled. Thomas woke with a start.
"You were supposed to be off 5 minutes ago,"
the red engine said. "Oh dear, I'd better get going," cried Thomas as he shot out of the station. Despite him going as fast as he could, he was late at every stop, and the passengers were not happy. Neither was the Fat Controller when he heard the news.
"I've heard complaints aplenty from the passengers about you being late all day because you weren't getting enough sleep. It is very important that you get sleep every night.
The Fat Controller said that evening.
I expect you to rest up tonight.
I'm sorry, sir, but I can't, said Thomas. The Fat Controller stared.
And why ever not?
He asked sternly. Because something tried to attack me the other night, Thomas replied.
What sort of something?
Asked the Fat Controller. I couldn't see it fully due to the fog, but I could just make out the smoke box and... Thomas shivered. All I could see on the front of the smoke box were two tiny white dots where the eyes would have been.
You must have had a nightmare,
Percy put in.
You got scared of my story and your imagination went wild.
It was not my imagination, Thomas protested. I was awake when I saw that thing in the fog, but I couldn't move, speak, or even whistle for help. That godforsaken thing nearly got me, he cried. The Fat Controller listened.
I see now what it is you experienced,
he said after Thomas had finished.
What you went through that night was called sleep paralysis. It is when you're only partially awake, as in you can open your eyes and see, but the rest of your body isn't fully awake yet, meaning you can't use those parts of you,
he explained. How does that explain the thing I saw? Thomas asked.
During these night's sleep paralysis episodes, you can go into a state of panic because of your inability to use anything other than your eyes,
the Fat Controller continued,
which causes you to see horrifying things that aren't there. The ant engine that you saw was one of those hallucinations.
So that thing was just my imagination, Thomas said.
Exactly,
the Fat Controller replied.
And it's not only with you. Sleep paralysis can happen to anyone.
That's a relief, Thomas said.
Now that that's cleared up, I expect you won't have any more problems,
the Fat Controller asked. No, sir, I won't, answered Thomas.
That's a good engine,
said the Fat Controller.
If you have another experience with sleep paralysis, just keep calm and keep your eyes closed, and it'll pass,
he added before turning and walking away. Thomas slept peacefully at night and was punctual with his passenger run the next day. Thankfully, he never had another experience of sleep paralysis again after that night.
The cold wind blew, and the sky was already beginning to glow with the approach of the dawn. Down the quiet rails, a single steam engine hissed along at a breakneck pace. The engine was in British Rail green, and pulled a single coach with a brake van screeching along behind. Oliver huffed and puffed loudly as he rushed along. He'd been stuck waiting in an old siding for a late-night goods to pass. The goods had been hours late, and he'd not wanted to risk being seen by diesels. He'd been stuck on a disused branch for weeks, listening to the diesels growl as they looked for a runaway steam engine. Now was the time to make a run for Sodor. But with the sun rising, Oliver knew he wasn't going to make it to his next hiding spot before the dawn. That meant he might be caught, and his run for freedom would be for nothing.
Oh dear. Oh dear,
tittered Isabel, his coach.
Driver, we're not gonna make it,
Oliver said.
Indeed. We might need to find a different hiding spot. And fast.
Just as the sun began to shed its golden rays on the tops of church steeples, Oliver hissed into a disused shunting yard. Weeds had taken over the tracks, and the station sat closed, with boards on its windows and graffiti on its walls. It felt very eerie, but with the sun almost up, it would have to do. The driver and fireman changed the points, and Oliver, with Isabel in towed, slipped into the yard. They hid in the furthest siding from the main line. Trees and bushes had grown thickly here, and a derelict engine shed gave further cover. The fireman dropped Oliver's fire quickly.
Just as well we stopped. We're almost out of coal.
Do you think it'll be enough to get us to Sodor?
Oliver asked worriedly.
I don't know,
said the fireman gravely.
We'll need to source some more. We've gotten so far already, we can't fail now.
The engine crew quickly placed rubbish on and around Oliver to better keep him hidden while they went out to find extra coal.
We'll be back soon, old boy. Hopefully someone will have some coal to spare.
Then they left. Isabel and Toad fell asleep after a while. Oliver, however, couldn't sleep so easily. Soon, the sound of diesels running past on the main line could be heard, growling as they rumbled past. He kept a careful watch, listening for a sound that would mean they'd been spotted. But it didn't take long before Oliver drifted off to sleep as well. The sound of a robin twittering in a nearby tree could be heard between the growling purrs of diesels.
This place looks good.
Oliver woke with a start. The voice was not his crew or even Toad's. It was accompanied by a deep rumbling of a diesel engine. 2 of them. Oliver peered through the rubbish that was piled on his front, looking out. There were 2 diesels. One was a small shunter, and the other was a larger mainline diesel. Between them was a long scrap train, sitting in the yards off the main line. They were only 2 tracks away. Oliver bit on his tongue, trying to remain as silent as he could. The shunter spoke up.
You couldn't have picked a cleaner yard. Sitting here, this scrap will fall apart before we can get it to the scrap yard. It's off the main line, and you know how our controller will have a fit if we block the main line. Heck, he might toss us on the scrap pile if we do that.
The other diesel grumbled.
Yeah, so why are we leaving our haul of scrap here again? 'Cause the scrap yards you want to go to has cheated us out of hundreds of pounds many times before. I am sure another place will give us more for this junk. If you insist. Then we'll take some of this junk and see what other places will pay, and we'll go to the place that will pay the most.
The big diesel rumbled back and looked at the scrap train.
We should fill these trucks up a bit more to look like we have more to bring in. These trucks are hardly loaded. Well, lucky you. My driver brought a cutting torch. We'll just cut some extra of this kettle and add it to the trucks.
Oliver gasped silently as he heard the hiss of a cutting torch, followed by the sudden loud screaming of the engine being cut up. He couldn't see this engine, as the big diesel obscured his sight, only being able to see the sparks hitting the ground. He closed his eyes and tried hard to ignore it, but it was not possible. The screams carried on for what felt like forever. Eventually, the sound of diesels departing could be heard, a few trucks rattling behind them. The screams stopped and slowed into a series of pained moans. Oliver felt a small comfort that Isabel and Toad seemed to still be sleeping, somehow able to have slept through the screams. He supposed where they were, such noises were more muffled and less audible to wake them.
Hey, you.
A voice called. Oliver opened his eyes. The voice was not of his crew. The only other owner of the voice had to be the scrap engine. Nervously, Oliver turned and looked over at the engine. It was a rust-covered Ivet. Its tender was missing, and the amount of rust almost obscured its once bright black livery. The engine looked over at Oliver and sighed.
You poor thing,
he said slowly.
I truly feel sorrow for you.
Oliver looked puzzled.
Sorrow? How could you feel sorrow for me? You're on a scrap train with... those horrible diesels. And they cut parts of you off.
I've made my peace. That is the end, dear engine. I feel sorry that you are where you are now, stuck in hiding on a railway that has thrown us all away.
Oliver felt nervousness creep into his boiler. He began to worry this engine would call attention to him. But he needn't worry, as the engine then added hastily,
Don't worry, I won't tell them about you. You are very well hitting. And those engines only care about the scrap on this train. They won't dare look on your way. Besides, don't know how much longer I have myself.
What do you mean?
The old engine wearily looked back up at Oliver. He didn't say anything for a moment. Oliver felt he could tell what he was about to say just by the look in his eyes.
I spent so many years resting away. It's taken a toll on me. Soon, there won't be enough of me to wake up. It'll be the end. Forever.
A chill ran through Oliver's frames. He remembered the stories of what old engines felt just before they passed away. Those that were lucky enough to be spared being alive when the cutting began. How gradually engines would first feel pain in their bodies as the rust set in. Then gradually, that pain became less and less. Physical sensations would fade shortly after. An engine would become tired and want nothing more to do than just close their eyes and rest. And then, in a blink, they'd be gone, leaving a smokebox door in its place. The old engine coughed and brought Oliver's attention back.
What's your name, youngster?
Oliver. And what's yours?
Howard.
The old engine said.
Oliver?
Isabel moaned.
We're trying to rest. Do you want to get us caught?
Howard blinked in surprise.
What? Who said that? I thought we were alone.
No,
Oliver said quickly.
I'm here with my coach Isabel and a brake van named Toad. We're escaping.
Howard sighed heavily.
Oh, dear. You are that engine the diesels talk so much about. Rumors one of us is fleeing scrap. I don't wish to spoil your hopes, Oliver, but there is nowhere to go. The northern region, the south and the east, and your home of western regions have thrown us to the side. Why do you flee?
Because there's a place where steam engines are safe. The northwestern region, Sodor.
We're going there, Mr. Howard.
Toad said from the back.
We hear that railway's looking forward to keeping steam engines in service.
Howard looked away, his face still gloomy.
Sweet thought, but it's not possible. All the controllers have gone in and unanimously said that diesels are the way forward, and that's such a long trip, especially for a tank engine such as yourself. Doubt you're in very good condition for working life, Oliver, given the state of our railways.
Oliver felt indignity rising in his boiler. Sodor was his last hope, and while he knew his condition was a little worse for wear, he was certain he'd make it.
I might be rough, but Sodor is a haven for steam engines. Those engines pull actual trains, and they're taken care of no matter how rough of a state they're in.
But the diesels...
We read in a newspaper that Sodor will never be like this.
Oliver snapped.
My driver and fireman read in a paper that the famous Flying Scotsman is visiting there, and the controller made a statement saying his railway will never become like the mainland England. That is why we're going there. It's hope. Something you've got none to give.
The old engine looked at the enraged tank engine and sighed again, looking down at his buffers.
You are partially right. I have no hope. It's only for myself and my state. That controller on that island doesn't indeed sound like a wonderful person. To invite Scotsman, a preserved steam engine, you must value preservation.
He then paused and looked over to Oliver.
I must have a little hope that some of us steam engines will survive, so long as there are people who see value in us. I do hope you are correct, Oliver, and that if you do make it, that you would cherish that opportunity. You'll be another very lucky few who defy the world and make it.
Oliver suddenly felt sorry that he'd lost his temper. This poor engine, who'd been cut up while he was still alive, still held out hope that he'd survive, even if he had no more hope for himself.
Anyways, it's late now, and you are to make it. You need plenty of rest for it.
Alright, I'm sorry I snapped Howard. Just, none of the engines on my old line felt I'd make it.
The old engine sighed and coughed a moment, his lips pulling back in a small, faint smile.
It's alright. Just keep that energy when you really need it. Show any doubters why you are a survivor, but never forget to take your time and enjoy the time you have, like I'm going to.
And with that, the engine yawned and closed his eyes. Oliver stayed awake a moment longer, listening to the engine snore. Soon the sound put him to sleep, with Isabel and Toad following suit not long after. Oliver was woken by the sound of diesel engines. They had come back. He turned to look at Howard and gasped. Instead of a face, all that greeted Oliver was an empty smoke box. Oliver felt terrible. Even without a fire, he felt colder than he'd ever been before. To have spoken to an engine one day, and then see them just gone the next. He didn't know it was possible to feel this terrible.
Glad we took that scrap to some other yards. We would have lost a good 130 pounds going to the one you suggested.
The big diesel chuckled.
Blow it out of your exhaust. Let's just hurry up and get the slug there before they change their mind.
The shunter stopped at the rusty engine's remains.
Look at this. He's gone. Surprised he lasted as long as he did, that useless kettle. At least he won't complain anymore. Not any more than his useless old body does already.
The diesels cackled with laughter as they backed up to the train and coupled up. Oliver watched as they took Howard's rusty body away, laughing all the time. This had once been a living engine, and to hear them laugh at his demise like it was nothing, it made Oliver sick. Later, when Isabel and Toad had awoken, they asked if the diesels had come back. Oliver took a deep breath.
They've already come and gone.
He said,
I didn't hear them come back.
Oh my.
Isabel whimpered.
Poor Howard. To be left with those brutes. He must be terrified.
Oliver sighed and stared out at the empty yard before him.
How terrified he must be, indeed.
As soon as night fell, Oliver's crew had returned. They hadn't found much coal, but they had found some. They quickly built up Oliver's fire and gave him plenty of steam. Slowly, Oliver clanked along through the bushes and weeds. His wheels squeaked as he rolled over the tracks the scrap train had been on. He saw pieces of melted metal lying amongst the weeds, their edges blackened by the cutter's torch, and caked in brown rust. For a moment, he thought he saw an engine's lamp, its lens shattered. He gulped as he headed onto the main line, his fire flaring into life with determination.
Steady, boy. We need to go carefully.
His driver said, checking him.
I'll get to Sodor or bust.
Oliver said to himself.
I need to. For Howard.
Oliver rumbled over the points and off into the distance. Oliver now lives on Sodor. He made it to Barrow and Furnace before his coal gave out. Luckily, he was found and completed the final leg of the trip to Sodor thanks to Douglas. Now he, Isabel, and Toad work on the Little Western branch line with Duck and 3 more auto coaches. Since arriving, he's had many adventures and made many happy memories. When visitors ask about his past, only the version of his escape written down by the Reverend Audrey is told. None of his retellings include those 2 nights in that sighting, or of what happened there. Oliver, however, has reconciled with these memories, and the full horror has become softened to where telling his story of escape has become easier to talk about. Though sometimes when he's asleep, his mind drifts to the shadows of the past he keeps buried away. His dreams are then filled with the crystal clear sounds of diesel engines, pained screams, and the hiss of a cutter's torch.
Thomas yawned as he felt the warmth spread through his boiler. He heard the quiet conversation of Percy talking with his driver, something to do with the post.
Are you sure there isn't anything for me?
Percy asked.
Afraid not. Just some letters from family living on the mainland and other junk mail.
His driver said.
What's got you interested in the post, Percy?
Thomas asked with a yawn.
I know you like that job, but I don't think anyone would be writing to you. You don't even have a post box for Tom Tipper to put any letters in.
He added cheekily. Percy rolled his eyes and scoffed.
I'm looking for letters from my friends on the other railway, Thomas. I worked in many little yards before Sir Topham Hatt bought me and I came to live on Sodor. Our drivers helped to keep us in touch by writing letters. I've gotten a few recently, but none from Ginty and Pug. You remember them, right? They came to help while we went to London to visit.
Thomas did remember them, and he could remember making a fool of himself in front of Ginty as he was showing off. Ginty had laughed at him, but they became friends by the time he and the other visiting engines returned back to their own railways.
I do, and that's strange indeed. You told me you were good friends with them, right?
Very good friends indeed. It's strange I've not gotten any letters from them. My driver has sent 2 letters asking if they are fine and to respond, but I've not heard anything since. I'm worried they might be withdrawn.
Pah!
Thomas scoffed.
As if that could ever happen. Shunters like Ginty and Pug are indispensable. Even if the other railway is pushing for more of those diesels like that one that came to the mainline sheds, we'll always have a place here.
I don't know, Thomas,
Percy said, unsure. Thomas huffed out of the sheds and went to pick up his coaches.
I'm sure they're fine. If I can, I'll go over and see what's keeping letters from them.
He hissed to himself, although he wasn't sure just how he would get the travel to the mainland. His chance came sooner than expected. Thomas was just puffing into Ellsbridge with his afternoon train when the yard foreman walked up.
There is an order for a shipment of stone to be brought down to Barrow in Furnish. Sir Topham Hatt says there are no spare engines other than you, Thomas. Think you can manage?
Thomas fizzed with excitement.
Certainly, I can do that.
Then the job is yours. Daisy will handle your passengers till you get back. It's a long way to get there, she'll be quick.
And then he walked away.
Now I'll see what's going on with Percy's friends and why they're not responding to his letters,
Thomas said to himself. The sun was getting low in the sky as Thomas rolled over the bridge onto the mainland. The little blue engine was bubbling with excitement. It had been years since he had last been there, and he was eager to see how much had changed. He chuffed past the station over to the goods yard. As he rounded the bend and crossed under the road, Thomas was struck by something. Some coal bunkers laid near the trackside, completely empty. A coal chute nearby was covered in rust, with an old sign hanging from one bolt, out of order. A nearby water column had a similar sign hanging from its release chain.
This is odd. How do you keep a shunting engine fueled without coal?
He thought. As Thomas came into the yard, he was struck by how silent it was. Trucks were all in the sidings, tidily arranged, and yet there was no engines to be seen. No clouds of steam and smoke in the air to give any hint that they were there. The air began to get cooler, and a mist was starting to form.
That's odd. How come I don't hear any whistles? A yard needs a pilot engine to look after it. Where are they?
A yard foreman walked up.
Just leave your train there. We'll get a shunter to move it later,
came the gruff response. Thomas looked around. He didn't see any other engines apart from himself. Before he could ask, he heard a growl and a roar from behind. Quickly, a big mainland diesel roared by, its dark blue and yellow paint standing out from the long train of dirty trucks. It roared through a warehouse loading platform and disappeared into the encroaching gloom.
But where's the shunter? I haven't seen or heard one since I arrived.
Who's over there?
Thomas looked over to see a faceless diesel rumble past, dragging a train of tankers. It seemed to growl louder as it passed by. As he looked around, he noticed signs. Diesel fuel, diesels park here, don't idle in sidings, and diesel loyal were what they said.
Where's Genty? Or Pug? Don't they work here?
Thomas asked sheepishly.
Don't know no Genty or Pug. Haven't had a Genty in this yard for... Ugh, I don't bloody know. Anyways, you're uncoupled, so why don't you get yourself out of my yard?
Thomas's crew, unnerved by the terse order, quickly opened the blue tank engine's regulator and they raced away into the distance.
We have to find a turntable or something to turn around. If only this fog wasn't so thick.
He was right. The mist was turning into fog as the temperature dropped. Thomas rattled over the points quickly. His eyes darted around as shapes appeared out of the gloom. Everywhere he saw diesel notices, coal bunkers filled with weeds and marked with masking tape crosses, indicating not to be used. Taking a guess, he followed a set of track curves between some buildings, which gradually became more open as the warehouse got smaller in scale.
This must be the way,
he thought. But it wasn't. Thomas followed the track for a ways, but nothing felt right. The tracks creaked and groaned under his wheels as the weeds brushed his chassis. Now he was certain this was the wrong way and he was lost. But up ahead he saw a gloomy shape of some steam engines in the dim dusk light.
Driver, look! Steam engines!
Thomas said hopefully.
Maybe they can tell us.
The words died in his mouth as the mist slowly cleared to reveal just where Thomas was. There were steam engines, but they were all covered in rust. They lay in piles near the tracks. Many did not have wheels and were just boilers stacked up haphazardly. The few engines still on the tracks chilled Thomas the most. These engines were not as rusty as the others, and seemed to have most of their parts, but they were silent. Silent and dead. Darkened smokebox doors stared out at Thomas, where their faces had once been. All the engines were small tank engines, just like him. Just like... Thomas gasped as he looked in the back and saw a familiar pair of engines. One had 6 small wheels, and the other had 4. Rust almost covered their early BR crests.
I think we should head back.
The driver stammered. Thomas said nothing, but he quickly puffed away the moment his regulator opened. The scrap engines faded away from view, and soon they were lost in darkness and distance. Percy parked his post vans neatly in the sidings and then puffed towards the sheds. As he chuffed over, he noticed one berth's doors were closed up tight. He puffed into his berth and saw Thomas sitting silently.
Thomas?
The blue engine jumped in shock as if he hadn't noticed Percy coming up. He then tried to force a scowl onto his face.
Percy! Don't do that!
He berated, trying to sound cross, though Percy could tell something was on his mind.
Sorry, how did your trip go? I'm certain you enjoyed it since you never get to travel along the main line. I know you love your branch line, but still, it's nice to get out sometimes.
Thomas looked around, as if not sure what to say. Percy puffed in and parked by his side.
How was the mainland? I'm sure a lot has changed. What station did you drop your train off at?
Barrow and Furnace.
Oh, that's where Ginty and Pug worked. I heard they were moved there following our trip to London. Did you see them there?
Thomas looked away and grimaced. Percy looked at him carefully, and in a moment he understood.
Yes, I saw them,
Thomas said.
They really miss you and said they couldn't write to you 'cause they were so busy. I mean, you know the other railway, always busy and...
They were scrapped, weren't they?
Thomas paused mid-sentence and looked at Percy. The expression on the green saddle tank was blank and firm. It wasn't one of worrying or anything, just acceptance, as if this was something he'd long suspected.
I'm sorry, Percy. I really am,
said Thomas sadly.
It's not the first time, Thomas. I've gotten letters from friends who've been withdrawn and scrapped. I only wish Ginty and Pug have written a letter to me to say goodbye. Maybe they did, and the letter was lost in the post. I guess I won't know.
Thomas looked at Percy with a sense of wonder. He'd always known that Percy was a cheeky, bouncy, somewhat naive engine. And yet, he was handling the news very well. He could see sadness in his eyes, but also acceptance that Ginty and Pug were no longer around. He wondered for a moment how Percy could be alright with that. Then, as if sensing his question, Percy spoke again.
We are very fortunate to live here with such a kind controller like Sir Tom had, aren't we, Thomas?
Yes, Percy. We are.
It took a while for the engines to move on. Percy recovered in remarkable time. Soon he was cracking jokes with the trucks and being cheeky as always. Thomas took some time. Sometimes, when he was in the shunting yards, he'd stare out along the main line, retracing his way back to those cold sightings in his mind. Eventually, work shoved those thoughts out of his mind, and a smile soon crossed his face once more. But it would be a long time before Thomas would ever dare journey beyond Sodor.